On January 12, 2010, JoAnn Matouk Romain attended a 7 p.m. prayer service at St. Paul in the Lake Catholic Church in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan. 20 minutes later, she left the church and would never be seen alive by her family again. From the South Shore of Lake Erie, this is Great Lakes True Crime. I wanted to thank those of you that have recently left some very positive reviews for the show on your podcast apps. It's been noticed and it's really appreciated. I'm glad you're listening and thank you for the feedback. Again, you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook. Just search for Great Lakes True Crime. Grosse Pointe, Michigan is a wealthy suburban enclave just north of Detroit. It's actually a collection of 5 separate cities, including Grosse Pointe City, Grosse Pointe Farms, Grosse Pointe Park, Grosse Pointe Shores, and Grosse Pointe Woods. JoAnn Matouk Romain was a resident of Grosse Pointe Woods, and if the area sounds familiar to you, it served as the setting of a 1997 romantic comedy starring John Cusack and Minnie Driver called Grosse Pointe Blank. As we said, on that January night in 2010, JoAnn attended a 7 p.m. prayer service at St. Paul Catholic Church in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan. She participated in the prayer service for approximately 20 minutes, when she then left the church and walked out into the bitter cold January night. Police say the 55-year-old left her purse, wallet, and cash in her car in the church parking lot, then crossed a divided 4-lane boulevard called Lakeshore Drive, walked through a snowy area in her high-heel boots, and then, they say, she crossed some rocks and crouched her way down 2 concrete seawalls where she entered the icy lake and disappeared into the night. The night that JoAnn disappeared, her Lexus SUV was left in the exit drive of the church parking lot, approximately 100 feet from frozen Lake St. Clair across the street. When police found the vehicle around 10 p.m., it was the only car in the parking lot. Grosse Pointe Farms Public Safety Officer Keith Colombo, out on routine patrol, came upon JoAnn's Lexus. Colombo was concerned by the fact that the Lexus was the only vehicle in the driveway. He saw no one else around, and it was late on a cold January weeknight. He approached the Lexus and shined his flashlight into the vehicle to confirm that there was no one inside, which there wasn't. Officer Colombo then returned to his patrol car and ran the SUV's license plate and discovered it was registered to Kathy Matouk and Michelle Romain, JoAnn's daughters, in Grosse Pointe Woods. Officer Colombo then got back out of his patrol car to check the area. Not seeing anyone, he thought that perhaps the driver and or occupants of the vehicle might be down by the lake because in his experience, people very frequently would park in the church parking lot and the streets adjacent to Lakeshore Drive and walk down to the water. The officer pointed the headlights and spotlight from his patrol car toward the lake. He also used his flashlight and the ambient light from the snow-covered ground to survey the area. He noticed footprints in the snow on the south side of Lakeshore Drive, leading to an embankment near the lake. The officer then walked across Lakeshore Drive to the curb closest to the lake, where he saw footsteps in the snow leading down. But it's important to note that Officer Colombo only saw the footprints down near the lake, not leading directly from the church across the street and down to the water. At the lakeshore, an impression in the snow on the first seawall looked like someone had sat down on the seawall and pushed off to get down to the second lower seawall. There were additional prints down there, suggesting that someone made their way down to the lake recently. Officer Colombo looked for footprints in the snow leading back from the water, but saw nothing but fresh snow. So whoever had been there, if there was a person there at all, may have entered the lake and not come back out. After a while, 2 more patrol officers arrived on scene. Considering what Officer Colombo had seen, the 3 officers believed someone might be in the icy water and called for an immediate search and rescue. They thought if someone was in the shallow lake, there was a good chance they could still be saved. So police called the U.S. Coast Guard, which ran an extensive search and rescue mission with a helicopter from 10:30 p.m. until 1:30 a.m. the next morning, but there was no sign of anyone in the water. Meanwhile, JoAnn's daughter, Michelle, began to worry when JoAnn hadn't made it home from the prayer service by 9 p.m. Michelle was 29 years of age at the time and lived with her 27-year-old sister, Kelly, and 20-year-old brother, Michael, in a home with JoAnn, who moved into the house after separating from her husband after 25 years of marriage. At 9:24 p.m., Michelle saw lights in the driveway and was immediately relieved, assuming it was her mother's car. Instead, she saw that the vehicle was a police car. Michelle walked outside to speak with the officer, who said that JoAnn's Lexus was found unattended in the parking lot. He wanted to know if JoAnn was missing. Obviously alarmed, Michelle called JoAnn's mobile phone, but there was no answer, going straight to voicemail instead. Against the advice of police, the 2 sisters then drove to St. Paul Church to look for their mother. What they found, however, looked like something straight out of a movie scene, according to Kelly. It was a full-fledged crime scene, complete with lots of flashing lights, a helicopter searching overhead, police tape around the Lexus, and generally chaos all around. JoAnn never did come home that night, and no one heard from her that night or any time after. In the following days, her family put flyers together and conducted a mass search with volunteers combing the area. JoAnn was a very social person and had lots of friends, so there were many people out looking for her. Police conducted a 3-day search, but there was no sign of JoAnn and no one had any idea where she could be. After the first few days, Grosse Pointe Farms Police turned the case over to Grosse Pointe Woods Police because that's the city where JoAnn lived. A specialty diving team called the Midwest Technical Recovery Team came into town and searched in Lake St. Clair for another 3 days. According to the search team, it was the most thorough search they had ever conducted, and after their exhaustive search, the team concluded that JoAnn was simply not in the water. There were no holes in icy areas, so it wasn't clear that anyone had ever gone into the lake in the first place, and the lake has virtually no current to carry a body away for any great distance. But more than 2 months later, on March 20th, a fisherman found JoAnn's body on the Canadian side of the Detroit River near the shore of Amherstburg, Ontario. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the area, the Detroit River flows from Lake St. Clair downstream to Lake Erie, with the river separating Detroit, Michigan from Ontario. The international border runs through the middle of the river. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, so it was not immediately identified as JoAnn. It was also impossible to determine a time of death, but various factors do point to the body having been in the water for a lengthy amount of time. 2 days after JoAnn's body was discovered, Canadian authorities confirmed her identity through dental records, and an autopsy concluded that there were no signs of foul play in her death. However, the family had a second autopsy performed, and it did reveal a bruise on JoAnn's upper right arm, which the family said supported their theory that she had been murdered. This second autopsy concluded that the cause of JoAnn's death was undetermined, meaning neither homicide, suicide, or accidental death could be ruled out. Still, police concluded that JoAnn likely took her own life in icy Lake St. Clair that night. Their theory, they said, was bolstered by statements they received from Michelle Romain in the days after her mother disappeared. We'll get into more details on that later. Additionally, police said JoAnn's Lexus had no sign of struggle and there was nothing suspicious on the ground nearby. No drag marks, no blood, and no bullet casings. JoAnn Matouk, JoAnn's brother, described her as an angel and the closest person to him in his life. She was pretty much everything to him. John cannot see any way that JoAnn would have taken her own life. It's just not possible, according to John. She exhibited no signs of depression and had a very active social life. The Matouk family had a history of infighting ever since JoAnn's parents died, and the family began squabbling over the inheritance. Later, when John Matouk got into legal trouble, there was more animosity within the family when JoAnn stood by John and supported him. Adding to the family's doubt over the suicide theory is that JoAnn's purse was ripped near the top. It wasn't a significant tear, but Michelle points out that police never fingerprinted the purse or attempted to collect DNA from it. Additionally, JoAnn's mobile phone and rosary were missing from her coat pocket. This was unusual, according to Michelle, as JoAnn would always carry both items with her. Regarding the suicide idea, Michelle said that, quote, "It's absurd. Nobody's going to jump into a shallow lake of freezing water. That's not going to be your first option." She further explained that her mother was a devout Catholic who was opposed to suicide. Michelle's belief is that her mother was abducted outside the church while walking to her car, and the purse was left on the seat to make her death appear to be a suicide. The night that JoAnn disappeared, a witness saw her leave the church at 7:20 p.m., while a minute later, another witness saw and heard a Lexus car alarm go off. Of course, as we said, JoAnn drove a Lexus, although it's not certain that it was the same vehicle. About half an hour later, at 7:50 p.m., a third witness reports to have seen a man who seemed out of place, wearing a light coat and scarf, running along Lakeshore Drive near the church. Police later found the scarf, bagged it into evidence, but later inexplicably donated the scarf to charity. The family hired Sal Rastrelli, a private investigator and water expert, to look into their mother's death. Sal has traveled all over the United States looking into suspicious deaths and sees many times when police immediately conclude something was a suicide, and then everything after that is essentially tunnel vision, with police not looking into any other possibilities. It seems that maybe this was one of those cases. In 2016, on the 6th anniversary of her mother's death, Michelle Romain thought she was finally getting close to proving that JoAnn's death was a murder based on documents that she got from the U.S. Coast Guard through a public records request. Michelle said she has time-stamped Coast Guard records that raise serious questions about the timeline of the police investigation and search efforts. Records show that the Coast Guard received a phone call requesting a search for JoAnn at 9:30 p.m. on the night she disappeared, but police didn't run the Law Enforcement Information Network check that kicked off the investigation until a half hour later at 10 p.m. Michelle also states that a police car showed up at her house about a half hour before her mother was actually declared missing. So there are several potentially significant issues with the timeline, as it's officially reported. Michelle didn't stop there, however. She hired her own pathologists, scientists, investigators, and lawyers, all of whom have helped put together a long list of clues that Michelle thinks proves her mother did not take her own life. The evidence Michelle put together to bolster her side of the story includes the fact that there was no hole in the ice on the frozen lake. The footprints in the snow that police found leading to the water matched those of a larger athletic or business shoe instead of the small, high-heeled boots that her mother wore that night. As we alluded to earlier, there was very little current to have carried her mother's body 30 plus miles away. Plus, JoAnn gassed up her car on the way to church, so Michelle questions why she would fill up the gas tank before taking her own life. 2 of JoAnn's doctors, her 3 children, a sister, and friends all say she had no history of mental illness or suicidal tendencies, as police claimed, and all this information was included in a lawsuit that Michelle and her siblings filed in federal court. In the trial, 2 forensic experts, including a University of Michigan pathologist, determined that JoAnn's death was caused by dry drowning, which means there was no water in her lungs when her body was found, and her breathing was compromised before she entered the water. Dry drowning apparently accounts for about 1 to 2% of all drowning deaths, so it's not common, but it's not out of the question either. An autopsy by the university pathologist did reveal those bruises on JoAnn's upper arm, and he found that the handles on the designer purse she carried that night were torn, pointing to a potential struggle. Michelle and her siblings ultimately sued 2 municipalities, 13 individual police officers, a police chief, and 1 cousin. She believes that her mother was abducted from the church, murdered elsewhere, and her body dumped into the river down near Belle Isle, which is much closer to the area where her body was discovered. Michelle thinks this was a result of some personal vendetta involving a relative. She also thinks a number of police officers know about the murder and engaged in a cover-up by saying it was suicide to protect the killer. From the police standpoint, Grosse Pointe Farms Police Lieutenant Rich Rosati said they had never closed off the idea that something nefarious happened, but it's just that nothing had been presented to police to change their minds regarding the suicide. Lieutenant Rosati was one of the defendants in the $100 million civil lawsuit filed by all 3 of JoAnn's children. The suit alleged wrongful death and civil rights violations. Shortly after the lawsuit was filed, Lieutenant Rosati declined to comment specifically on the suit, but did stress that police conducted a proper investigation. Quote, "Nothing that has been presented to us has proven to be foul play. We have followed up on all leads, contrary to what has been said, but we have not found anything that would substantiate the presence of foul play." Rosati went on to say that Michelle stated that JoAnn had become paranoid in the months before she died. She thought she was being followed, that her cell phone was being tapped, and JoAnn was convinced apparently that people were entering her home. She even had the locks changed on her home, according to a Grosse Pointe Farms detective. But JoAnn's daughter, Kelly, pointed out in an interview that if someone really is out to get you, you're not being paranoid. The cousin who was sued in this case was Tim Matouk, a former police officer in the nearby city of Harper Woods, and now an investigator with the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, which is the county where this ordeal took place. According to court documents, a witness told police that he saw Tim with JoAnn near Lake St. Clair on the night she vanished, but claimed police never contacted him until 2 years later, shortly after he spoke with the FBI about what he saw. This would seem to be an astonishing development if it were true. Michelle and Kelly also claimed that several weeks before their mother disappeared, she received a phone call from Tim Matouk. The 2 daughters say that JoAnn and Tim argued during that phone call until a point where their mother suddenly turned white. After the call, JoAnn allegedly said to her daughters that if anything happened to her or if she went missing, Tim Matouk should be the one to be looked at. Tim would later say that the call was about a family fight over JoAnn's brother John, who has a criminal record and, according to Tim, was passing bad checks. Tim Matouk has denied having anything to do with his cousin JoAnn's disappearance and says he's a victim of a witch hunt. He also says he was working the night of JoAnn's death on a stakeout in Warren, Michigan, According to Tim, his cousin JoAnn Matouk, JoAnn's brother, remember, always blamed Tim for his own legal problems, which included the passing bad checks, and that the heated phone call he had with JoAnn had to do with JoAnn also blaming Tim for John's legal troubles. Tim believes that JoAnn likely went down to the lake and perhaps slipped and fell into the water rather than committing suicide. The $100 million federal lawsuit was eventually dismissed, and a federal appeals court upheld the dismissal in 2019. JoAnn Romain's disappearance has triggered a great deal of controversy and public intrigue over the years. No criminal charges have ever been filed in the case. A great deal of people have expressed doubt over the suicide theory, noting that jumping in a shallow, icy lake in the dead of winter, January in Detroit, just doesn't make sense. Was it even possible to get down to the lake and then through the frozen lake surface that night? Could it have been an accident where JoAnn did slip and fall into the icy water? Or was it foul play, as the family suspects? What do you think happened? Hit up the Great Lakes True Crime Facebook page and let us know. Anyone with information on this case is urged to come forward and share what they know. A Facebook page dedicated to finding the truth about the death of JoAnn Romain implores anyone with information to call 855-411-5394 or email tips to info@scottlewispi.com. The reward for tips leading to an arrest is now at $200,000 according to the Facebook page. If you're interested in learning more about this case, there is an episode of Unsolved Mysteries on Netflix that deals with this, and I got some of the information from this episode for there. Speaking of Netflix, I haven't done any recommendations for a while, but I have been watching The Serpent, which is a story about a serial killer on the hippie trail in the 1970s. I don't want to give away too much, but it's pretty well done. It's based on a true story, but it's not a documentary. It's a drama. So check it out if it sounds interesting to you, The Serpent on Netflix. And that's it for this episode of Great Lakes True Crime. If you like the show, please be a friend and tell a friend. As I said, you can also follow the show on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for Great Lakes True Crime. This has been Steve, your host and producer. Thanks for listening, guys.